This video is sponsor free thanks to my supporters on Patreon. Mob Entertainment recently gave us another look at one of the upcoming toys we are most likely going to see in Poppy Playtime Chapter 4. This time it's something completely different. A dinosaur. Forgetting somebody, Mob? Forgetting Bron? Are we? I didn't forget Bron. Where's Bron, Mob? Where is he? Where's Bron? He's the scariest dinosaur. Where is he? Justice for Bron! Give us Bron! But the most interesting part of this teaser trailer wasn't actually the toy. Sorry, Pianosaurus. Should have been called Pianosaurolophus, just saying. No, the most interesting part is this screen. At first it plays an advert for the toy, nothing out of the ordinary for Poppy Playtime, but as the screen starts to change, it once again shows us this symbol we've been seeing for a long time now, the eye. It's been made very clear that this symbol, or maybe even character, is going to be something important in Chapter 4, but what is it and what does it mean? Well, in today's Tericho theory, not only am I going to attempt to answer what I believe the eye represents, but I'm also going to explain how it could relate to Poppy and her dark plan for the player. This mysterious eye entity is something that I am convinced is going to be a big part of Chapter 4's story and Poppy Playtime's future. It's popped up many times now and it has been the center point of several trailers. It's even something we got hints at in the official Discord. But to try and figure out what this is, I think we need to look at the past. Back in Chapter 1, we knew pretty much nothing about the story of Poppy Playtime. All we knew was that this factory had closed after the staff had all gone missing 10 years earlier. We learnt this from a letter that was sent to us alongside a vintage Playtime Co VHS. The letter told us that the staff were still there, and our main objective was to find the Poppy door. Of course, once inside the factory, we immediately began to learn that things were not all that they seemed. The factory wasn't abandoned at all like we thought, and once we eventually found Poppy, someone had left us several warnings to stay away. But even before then, there was a huge clue that I think many people have forgotten about, or at the very least, overlooked. The most distinct thing in Poppy Playtime's story are the experiments, living toy creatures that we now know were brought to life through a scientific process. This process likely started as a way for the company to create the most lifelike toys possible. But, as I have theorized before, this might have developed into a way for Playtime Co to save sick and dying children. After all, this was a huge part of Elliot Ludwig's mission. The founder of Playtime Co seemed to really care for children, so much so that he set up an orphanage program inside the factory to help those less fortunate find a family. But we now know that this process was eventually twisted and warped by none other than Sawyer. He changed this process to benefit himself and the company, not the children. In his Bigger Bodies initiative, Sawyer began to use this scientific process to turn children into cheap labor for the company. This stood in exact opposition to Elliot's original vision, and we now know from the latest ARG that there might be more to this than we first thought. We recently learned that Sawyer was a part of Elliot's Young Genius program, something that was likely designed to give those Playtime Co orphans a better education, but also likely a good way to find future employees for the company's research and development teams. A win-win for everyone. However, Elliot slowly grew worried of Sawyer. He noticed a lack of empathy, a lack of care for the children. Sawyer only wanted to push the boundaries of science no matter the cost, something that scared Elliot. So in response, and with regret, he removed Sawyer from the program. This seemed to deeply wound Sawyer, who clearly holds a grudge against Ludwig. It definitely seems like the Bigger Bodies initiative was an excuse for Harley to practice his experiments unrestrained, but it now seems like it might have also been a way to get back at Ludwig. By using children who were supposed to be given a new life as his guinea pigs, he was spitting in the face of all that Elliot built. Put a pin in this feud because we'll be coming back to this one later. So how does all of this relate to the eye that we keep seeing? Well, I think the key lies within this scientific process. Back in Chapter 1, right before we find Poppy, we find the final VHS tape of the chapter. In this tape, we can hear a scientist talking about the event that we now know was called the Hour of Joy, the downfall of the factory at the hands of the experiments that were created there. Now we do hear the scientist again in Chapter 3, but the weirdest part of this first tape is that he doesn't sound too alarmed, even as his colleagues are being torn apart right outside this door by one of the Bigger Bodies, probably Huggy. But to make this even more mysterious, he states that he isn't concerned for his own well-being. He says,
"I'm not worried about myself. One breakthrough and I'll be back."
Even from chapter 1, I found this very strange. It seemed like the scientist wasn't concerned of death because he had found a way to cheat it or perhaps even reverse it. But with more and more pieces of this puzzle falling into place, the more I am convinced that this scientific process is more complicated than we first assumed. On the face of it, the process seems simple. You take a living person and you turn them into a living doll. But of course, if you think about it, it's far more than that. Playtime Co had figured out a way to transfer human consciousness. Playtime Co figured out a way to take this consciousness and transfer it into a different body. But more alarmingly, they figured out a way to put it inside an inanimate object. This opens up so many opportunities for the story to throw a curveball at us. If Playtime Co were able to transfer consciousness from human to a doll, then what else could they transfer it to? This TV, the phone, suddenly all of these objects have the potential to be far creepier than we thought. Now, to be fair, we've all pretty much considered this part already. But what you might not have considered is that if Playtime Co figured out how to do it one way, then it might even be possible to reverse it. Looking back at chapter 2, we found a file on Elliot's desk that heavily implied they were trying to bring a dead rat back to life. It's unclear if they managed to figure this out or not, but the fact that they were researching it in the first place is a huge clue. This could tie to what the scientist was talking about in chapter 1. If he managed to transfer his consciousness somewhere before his death, then it might be possible to bring him back, either in a new body or a doll. This also ties into Harley Sawyer's own research. It now seems likely that he was never given the opportunity to learn the secrets of the scientific process from Elliot, the genius behind the entire company. So in a way to get this knowledge for himself, he had to try and reverse engineer it from the body of Experiment 1006, who is likely a creation of Elliot, but possibly even Elliot himself. One thing that I've never really considered until recently is the possibility that we've all been wrong about 1006 from the start. He is named the prototype, and many of us have assumed that his body was unfinished, owing to the fact that we only ever see his arm and it isn't covered like the rest of the bigger bodies. But maybe this is actually what is left of 1006 after Harley essentially tortured him. The prototype did say,
"You stick us, beat us, tear at flesh."
But since we know it's possible for Playtime Co to transfer human consciousness, and they were researching the ability to bring people back from the dead, I think you can see where I am going with this. When we learned that the staff are still there, that was true. Those staff are just trapped inside some sort of system. This key point almost solves every unanswered mystery we've had since the very beginning. How did the staff survive without food all those years? Well, like the prototype, they don't need to eat in their current form. In response to the Hour of Joy, key staff members underwent a temporary transfer process. Think of it like an emergency cryosleep, except being awake and trapped inside some sort of screen. The scientist from chapter 1 wasn't concerned about dying because he knew they could continue to work on their research until they eventually found a way to reverse the process. The reason why the factory hasn't been condemned? Well, the staff have been talking to relevant authorities, using their power and influence to keep the factory untouched. Owing to the fact that the letter we were sent said "we're still here," likely means that it was a staff member that summoned us to the factory, a colleague of ours. But I did say that this theory relates to Poppy and a dark plan that she has for us. Poppy is possibly one of the most mysterious characters in the series so far. Is she an ally? Is she an enemy? What exactly does Poppy want with us? Well, I think the answer to this question is now more obvious than ever, but to figure this out, we need to look at the clues the series has been giving us. One of the biggest conflicts the game has been setting up is between 1006 and Harley Sawyer. As I discussed earlier, this feud seems to have a deeper reason. Sawyer doesn't care about the children at all, even the experiments he had a direct hand in creating. There is a clear psychological theme in this series: attachment theory. Sawyer created both Boxy Boo and Yarnaby. While he might talk about them with pride, it's only a pride in his own accomplishments. Boxy was Sawyer's way of proving that he could create the bigger bodies, and he used him to get rid of employees who asked too many questions. But Yarnaby looked to Sawyer like a father figure. Quinn Navidson, the child who would become Yarnaby, was reclusive, shy. He didn't get along with many people, and once transformed into Yarnaby, he formed an attachment to a select few security staff. Those staff pitied Yarnaby. Since Sawyer's process wasn't complete, Yarnaby lacked many higher cognitive functions. He essentially became an animal like a dog or a cat. This actually now explains why Huggy cannot talk but Mummy can. Yarnaby was experiment 1166 and Huggy was created just a few experiments later, being experiment 1170. By the time they got to Mummy, experiment 1222, they had learned, refined the process, innovated. Remember, innovation is key. An interesting point to note here is look how long it took Harley Sawyer to figure this out. This is something that we assume Elliot figured out a long time ago with Poppy. But despite how some staff pitied Yarnaby, Sawyer planned to take advantage of his state. Knowing that Yarnaby only ever trusted select staff, Sawyer planned to manipulate this to his advantage. He planned to isolate him, make him, in his words, his entire world. This is something we see he was successful with Yarnaby becoming so attached to Sawyer that he became depressed when he wasn't around, but more importantly, aggressive to all the other staff. This is actually something I discussed before in Chapter 2. We have evidence that Mommy Longlegs was sent for conditioning, and I theorized that this was psychological conditioning. After all, Playtime Co were meddling with people's biology, why not meddle with their psychology too? This psychological meddling, coupled with the trauma of undergoing life-altering surgery, is probably why so many of these toys end up so monstrous. But the major point here is that Yarnaby was now very clearly attached to Harley Sawyer. Like I said earlier, this is a psychological principle. As children, we usually form an attachment with our parents. This makes sense. From an evolutionary standpoint, we need to attach to our primary caregivers to survive. Now, there are actually different types of attachment and they usually develop from our upbringing and environment. But like I say, they usually form with your parents. But these experiments are still children and they are all orphans. They don't have parents. It would be only natural for these children to form attachments with the staff that care for them. The staff essentially became their surrogate parents. And just like with parents, they don't have to be good caregivers for these attachments to form. But this contrasts perfectly with 1006. Sawyer viewed these experiments as nothing more than his personal accomplishments. He pitied them more than anything, even as they looked to him as a father. He proved time and time again that he would sacrifice their own well-being for his own end. Compare this to 1006. The prototype was trying to escape the factory with the help of Theodore Gramble, the child who would eventually become Catnap. Just like Quinn with Sawyer, Theo had developed an attachment to the prototype. He helped him gather files and he even helped him operate the grab packs needed to escape. But in complete contrast to Sawyer, 1006 showed that he cared for the orphans above himself. Just as the prototype was about to escape, the door being open in front of him, Theo was electrocuted when the grab pack he was operating malfunctioned. 1006 could have escaped in this moment, but he gave up his own freedom to save Theo's life. He took the boy to Thomas Clark, the man who would eventually be transferred into a small Bron. Thomas was a pediatrician, and by taking Theo to him, 1006 saved his life at the cost of his own freedom. Something that eventually led to him being tortured by Harley Sawyer. But even the music video by CG5 supports this idea. Looking at how the prototype behaves around Catnap, and you can see that he genuinely does care for him. He offers him comfort in the best way that he can. He behaves like a father. Some mentioned how Theo treated the prototype like a god, and that makes sense since that is effectively how children view their parents, up until a certain age. But it goes even further than that. 1006 not only feeds the toys, but he seems to keep them safe. He let Mommy have pretty much free reign inside the game station, only taking her body after we killed her. It was the same with Catnap. He let Theo live freely in the playcare, and only once he was electrocuted again and set on fire did he put him out of his misery. Something that again, we did. Now on top of this, he gave us several, and I mean several, warnings to turn around and leave. He's had plenty of opportunities to kill us, but he gave us every chance to walk out the door. So from this point, it seems like the main conflict is between 1006, who genuinely cares for the orphans and wants to let them live out their lives in peace, versus Harley Sawyer, who wants to continue his twisted experiments and will use every single one of the orphans as fodder in order to do so. Seems simple enough, but there is of course the wild card, the one piece on this chessboard who we don't know which side she belongs to, Poppy. Up until this point, Poppy has supposedly been our main ally. We released her in Chapter 1, and in Chapter 2 she was helping us escape, till she didn't. Now in Chapter 3, Poppy is once again claiming to be on our side. She keeps telling us to trust her, which to me sounds like something someone untrustworthy would say. but she claims that we need to put an end to the prototype. Her claim is that the prototype was behind the Hour of Joy, the event which saw the toys rise up and overtake the staff, you know, by murdering them all. In her words, the prototype needs to pay for what he has done. She wants the prototype to die for killing all of the staff, including the ones that had no part in the experiments that occurred inside Playtime Co. Now on the face of it, this seems like a noble motivation, bringing a man who orchestrated a mass murder to justice, but it's way more complicated than that. Everything we have seen about the Hour of Joy points it to being a last resort. 1006 tried to escape, probably to alert the authorities, but ended up sacrificing himself to save Theo. After seeing just how evil and twisted Sawyer had become, after being tortured by his hand, 1006 thanks him, heavily implying that he finally felt justified in doing what he was about to do. But again, think about what the Hour of Joy represents. These orphans were being used, manipulated, and experimented on, now under the supervision of a madman. It really does seem like 1006 saw this as the only way to save the orphans. He had tried every other way and nothing else had worked. So for Poppy to be against him means that she has some other motivation. The orphans are not Poppy's main priority. But recently I had a bit of a revelation. Something clicked into place that makes all of this make way more sense. As I said earlier, both 1006 and Sawyer have shown that attachment theory is a key element to this story. Both had experiments that viewed them as a father, both had experiments that were loyal to them. Well, look at Poppy. She too has experiments that are loyal to her. If we are going by this attachment theory, then why else would Kissy and Ollie follow Poppy? Unless Poppy was also an adult. This would make a lot of sense. Poppy and Ollie seem to have intimate knowledge of how the factory works, even down to how the power is distributed around it. That doesn't seem like something the children would be taught. Poppy also seems to have a lot of inside knowledge around the Hour of Joy, the staff, and us. All of this points to her being an ex-staff member, something we know did happen. Thomas Clark was transferred into a Brondol, Miss Delight and the other teachers were clearly adults, and judging by how he behaves, it's likely that 1006 was an adult too. But to add even more weight to this theory, look at how all the adults who became experiments were treated. Bron was attacked by the other toys since they knew
$11.99 was different.
Miss Delight and the other teachers were locked away in the school to starve after the Hour of Joy, and Poppy was locked in her case, which was filled with the catnap gas to keep her asleep as well. If 1006's motivation for the Hour of Joy was to keep these orphans safe, then of course he wouldn't want any more ex-staff members roaming around. The risk of them continuing the experiments was just too high, but rather than having them killed, he had them locked away. It seems like this was even his strategy for Harley Sawyer. It's been heavily implied that Sawyer is locked down in the areas that we are traveling to in Chapter 4. It also seems like this area has been sealed off for some time. The elevator that accesses it has been without power, something that we just restored in Chapter 3. But this makes a lot of sense. 1006 cares deeply for the experiments, even the ones that don't align with him. That's why he let Mommy Longlegs roam freely even as she descended into madness. But we now know that Harley has his own entourage of toys loyal to him. The last thing 1006 would want is a civil war breaking out with these toys. Any casualties would just be more suffering for the orphans, the last thing that 1006 wants. So, reluctantly, he locked Sawyer and those toys loyal to him down in the depths where they could never escape. But this is where my biggest hint that Poppy is not to be trusted comes in. Knowing that Harley Sawyer is a monster, knowing that he uses anyone and everything for his own gain, and knowing that he doesn't care for the experiments at all, why the hell is Poppy taking us down to him? But once again, we already have the answer to this. Poppy knows that we are very good at getting rid of those in her way. Think about it, in Chapter 2 Poppy was helping us escape. It was only after we killed Mommy that she changed her mind. She has constantly called us capable, and she mentions this again in Chapter 3. Poppy knows that we are her best shot at getting rid of anyone who can stop her. And remember, someone really doesn't want Poppy to succeed in her goal. Someone was afraid of Poppy. This was likely 1006, since it's heavily implied that Catnap was the one that put Poppy in her case, his gas being there to keep her asleep. Well, what is Poppy's goal? What is the one thing that 1006 is most afraid of? He's most afraid of these experiments on the orphans continuing. This is something that we actually heard in Project Playtime. And how could that happen? Well, only if the staff were to make a return. Since it's likely that Poppy is ex-staff and she hates the prototype for killing the staff, we can pretty confidently conclude that Poppy's alignment is to the staff. Remember, Poppy was helping us, an ex-staff member, to escape. It's also incredibly likely that her ally, Ollie, was the one that sent us the letter in the first chapter. The letter we received in chapter 1 contained several mistakes in the spelling and grammar, something we also hear in Ollie's childlike speech in chapter 3. It would also make sense that Ollie sent the letter since Poppy couldn't write it while she was asleep. Well, that letter referred to the staff as "we're," implying that Ollie was also a staff member, or at least aligned with them. This now makes 3 distinct factions inside this factory: 1006 and his loyal subjects who are on the side of the orphans, Harley Sawyer and his cronies who are on the side of, well, Sawyer, and Poppy with her entourage who are on the side of the staff. This is why Poppy keeps saying she isn't our enemy. In her mind, since we are ex-staff too, she is on our side. In fact, I think there is a frightening but major possibility that Poppy's taking us down to Sawyer in order to broker a sort of alliance. 1006 is Poppy's main enemy, and you know what they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now that Poppy has us as a sort of leverage and protection, she might have thought that they could work together to take down 1006. This might even be why something attacked Kissy at the end of chapter 3. By this point, 1006 is getting desperate. He warned us against freeing Poppy, but we still did it. He asked us time and time again to leave, but we didn't. And now that we're about to meet with Sawyer, he sent someone to stop us forcefully. This is his MO, he uses force when all other options are exhausted. But I don't think working with Sawyer would be the end of Poppy's plan. She has shown several times now that she's two-faced. Her personality completely changed across chapter 2. At the start, she was sweet and innocent, playful even, but at the end she took on a much more sinister, scheming tone. It was almost like her mask slipped for a moment. I think Poppy's ultimate goal is to play Sawyer and 1006 off against each other, hoping that by forcing the two to clash, they will kind of cancel each other out, leaving her free to pursue her own plan. The plan to revive all those staff that are still trapped inside Playtime Co. This would actually stand against both 1006 and Sawyer. 1006 doesn't want any more experiments, and Sawyer wants to be left alone to do any experiments he sees fit. By this point, he doesn't really need anyone else, only subjects. Poppy essentially wants a hard reset. By forcing these two to fight each other, she clears the floor for the old staff to return. A return to glory for Playtime Co. This would actually be a very interesting theme. The Poppy doll was Playtime Co.'s original success, the doll that put them on the map. But over time, the company moved on to newer, better toys, and the Poppy doll was left forgotten, a relic of the past. This also happened with the living Poppy. As the company moved towards the bigger bodies, she too was sort of left behind. If the living Poppy was the one to return Playtime Co. back to its former glory, back to its heyday, then wouldn't that be a twist of irony? But with all this planning and scheming, there is one major point that it seems like Poppy hasn't considered: our loyalty. Right now we're working with Poppy, helping her towards her goals, but there is a major hint that we actually have our own agenda. The player seems to be more closely aligned to 1006 than Poppy. There were big hints in the orientation notebook that the character we play as could be its owner, PW, mostly due to PW's birthday being the same one that the Bunzo cutout repeats to us, and the fact that PW made arrangements to leave the company just before the hour of joy. That could explain how we managed to survive. But PW has shown that they at least on some level care for the orphans. PW was a scientist who was directly involved in the experiments inside Playtime Co., but they also show a high level of guilt for their involvement, even going so far as not being able to face the orphans because of it. This is a large reason why they wanted to quit in the first place, but the player character too has shown clear signs of guilt, particularly in chapter 3. This guilt is likely a major motivation for them returning to the factory and staying even after they learn of the danger. But this could make perfect sense. I have theorized many times now that these experiments began with good intentions. They were a way to save the sick and dying orphans, something we saw hints to in chapter 3. But we got a huge hint to this with Catnap. Theo was one of the many candidates for the bigger body catnap, but he was likely chosen after his accident as a sort of mercy. Theo was suffering in his human body. He was badly burnt and scarred, and we could even hear this in his cutout in Chapter 3. So his new body was kind of a gift, just like Thomas Clark, who was transferred after developing lung cancer. I've said this before, but lung cancer that was likely a result of working around all of that gas. Perhaps PW started working on these experiments, believing them to be a good thing, but he saw the company slowly change priorities under Harley Sawyer's direction. Perhaps the player's main motivation is to undo the wrongs that they had a direct hand in. Yes, this hand symbolism keeps popping up for a reason. In fact, it's actually quite ironic. These big players all have a hand in the game, while the rest of the staff can only sit back and watch. Symbolism! Symbolism everywhere! I believe that this game's biggest twist will happen soon. As we get closer to completing Poppy's plan, we will eventually realize we are once again on the wrong side. I think we're going to see a clash of these three big factions, brought on by Poppy's scheming. But before the war is over, we're going to realize that 1006 is the one that we need to help. All of this talk of him being the villain is just Poppy's way to trick us. But by then, Poppy's going to have far more power than she had at the start. As the true villain of this series, our final game will be Poppy's time to play. Now, of course, this theory hasn't really covered the identity of 1006 or Poppy in great depth. I still believe that 1006 could be Elliot and Poppy could be Stella, and this theory could still fit. We actually got a really weird hint to Poppy being Stella in the latest ARG too. Take a listen to Stella Graybird's voice. It kinda sounds like she slips into Poppy's voice for a second, and I don't think that was an accident.
Even the number of bodies?
But like I say, this theory could still fit. We know that Stella and Elliot seem like allies, but just like Sawyer, Stella eventually got betrayed by the company. One of her orphans, who was supposed to be up for adoption, was taken to be experimented on without her knowledge or consent. Perhaps she blames Elliot for letting this happen, or perhaps she just doesn't even know that 1006 is Elliot. Or, more convincingly, just like we've seen with Mommy, Poppy's mind has been slowly fractured. First from the stresses of the factory, second from consistent exposure to hallucinogenic gas, thirdly from a highly traumatic transfer process, and finally from the horror of the Hour of Joy. By this point, Poppy might be just as mad as Mommy was, just better at hiding it. Or who knows, maybe we're the mad one and everything's just in our imagination. Either way, I cannot wait for Chapter 4 to get some more clues to this, but as always, keep a watchful eye on Poppy. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next Tericho Theory.